in the ministry is an ongoing experience of rejection. My lesson title this morning is called Plymouth Plantation, Over the Long Haul. And I'm sure I'm sharing it with you because I was back, thank you, I was back in Plymouth this summer and had the wonderful opportunity of spending 3 weeks in Duxbury, Massachusetts, which is only about 7 miles from Plymouth. And my brother, both brothers, and my mother now live there as well. And I spent July 4th night out in Plymouth Harbor in my brother's boat overlooking Plymouth Rock, the actual rock, and the reconstructed Mayflower. And let me tell you, I never had thought that would be something special, but I'm inclined to believe nobody should die without that special experience. It is really powerful. And as we sat out there, the Plymouth Philharmonic played all kinds of rich classical music, including the 1812 Overture with cannons. And as the cannons went off, the firecrackers were lit on the shore and lit the whole sky. And as I sat there, going out of my head with ecstasy and emotion, I thought, what would Miles Standish think if he were here at this minute? And an awful lot of me filled with the sense of what that time was all about. And you know, it's only 365 years ago that all took place. And it's miraculous when you think of what's happened to this country. And I'm inclined to believe that Miles Standish and Governor William Bradford would not be able to handle being here now. I'm not sure they could take the stresses or the pollution that you are all handling, or the cars, or the airplanes, or the space vehicles. I'm really not sure at all that would be able to be accepted into their systems. And I share that with you because I'm going to read to you some powerful passages. This is kind of a semi-historical lesson this morning, just as my lesson on the Reformation was. And I'm going to read to you a feeling of what their times were like and what they had to put up with. And hopefully I'll share it with you and give you a feeling, but at the same time, really the stresses they were put through are no different than the stresses we're put through. Ours are just different than theirs. But I want to communicate a message this morning that I hope will serve you in the midst of your stresses as we move toward this time of Thanksgiving. This book is called Plymouth Plantation. It was written by the second governor of Massachusetts. And Plymouth Plantation itself, you can visit now in its reconstructed form, and it sits up looking over the Plymouth Rock. And if you visit the Mayflower, the people who are there are fascinating because actually they are actors who are trained in the language of the time, the English accent and all the time. And if you say to them, like I was with my mother, and the lady said to her, whose name was supposed to be Mrs. Carver, and she said, where are you from, my dear? And my mother said, Massachusetts, with pride. And the lady said, oh, I've never heard of such a place. Because you see, at that point, Massachusetts did not have a name. And I said, have you heard of Plymouth Plantation? And she said, plantation? Never heard of such a thing as a plantation, but we are developing our land up there in the hills, which is exactly where Plymouth Plantation was built. So with that, I'd like to read to you about 3 scenes to give you a feeling of what they went through, and see if you can't fit yourself within them. And this is Bradford speaking. But here I cannot but stay and make a pause and stand half amazed at the poor people's present condition. And so I think will the reader too, when he well considers the same. Being thus past the vast ocean, and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies. And remember, this is after, what was it, 90 days on the ocean. Just feel what that must have been like. And oh, they've left tough times behind, but boy, were they in for tougher ones. They had no houses to greet them, or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. It is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them, and the barbarians were the Indians. But those savage barbarians, when they met with them, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for the season it was winter, and they that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent, and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangers to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. For summer being done, all things stand upon them, with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country full of woods and thickets represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. If it be said they had a ship to take care of them, it is true. But what heard they daily from the master and company back in England? Well, all they heard was that with speed they would bring them whatever victuals they needed, only to realize that they probably would never arrive, and when they arrived they would all be too old to be eaten. Yea, it was muttered by some that if they got not a place in time, they would turn them and their goods ashore and leave them. Let it also be considered what weak hopes of supply and succor they left behind them, that might bear up their minds in this sad condition and trials they were under, and they could not but be very small. It isn't true, indeed, the affections and love of their brethren at Leyden in England was cordial and entire toward them, but they had little power to help them or themselves. And how the case stood between them and the merchants at their coming away had already been declared. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice and looked on their adversity. And then he quotes from David, let them therefore praise the Lord because He is good, and His mercies endure forever. Yea, let them which have been redeemed of the Lord show how He hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. When they wandered in the desert wilderness out of the way and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord His loving kindness and His wonderful works before the sons of men. I think it was that attitude that allowed them to survive. And now I'd like to read to you the Mayflower Compact that was written on board the Mayflower in Plymouth Harbor before they landed. Having undertaken for the glory of God, notice that, having undertaken for the glory of God, and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. They thought they were going to land in Virginia, you know. They missed. We do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws and ordinances from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. I would like to read to you the description of the first Thanksgiving. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All summer there had been no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first. Besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison. Besides, they had about a peck a meal a week to a person, or now, since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion. And now I'd like to read to you about the starving time. But that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 or 3 months' time, half of their company died, especially in January and February, being the depth of winter, and wanting houses and other comforts, being infected with the scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage and their inaccommodate condition had brought about them. So as there died sometimes 2 or 3 of a day in the aforesaid time, that of 100 odd persons scarcely ended up being 50. And then it accounts that amongst the people, as they experienced this disease and illness, that there began to be infighting and calamity, and that those who had appeared to be most strong, once they became infected and began to feel the closeness and the intimacy of death, closed up their hearts and were no longer able to give. And there began to be discontent amongst them as they watched those closest to them begin to die. And then finally, I'd like to read this to you. That what they had hoped would happen over in this sparse land was they had hoped that there would be some way for them to experience the bringing in of food to them, that other ships would come to them. But gradually, I don't know if you know this, but there were arguments with the company that was sponsoring them over here in Massachusetts, over in Massachusetts. And with that talk, they gradually lost the support of their group back in England and became ever more necessary to stand on their own 2 feet because there was no provision coming to them. There was no support coming to them. There was no outside force that would give them anything. They couldn't count on food being delivered. They had really just realized that they were stark, staring, absolutely alone here, and there was no support system. There was no post. There was no Wells Fargo Bank. There was nothing. There was just, here you are. And I'd like to read this last one before I share with you any related ideas. This is what Bradford says. All this was but cold comfort to fill their hungry bellies, for indeed they were hungry and starving. And a slender performance of his former late promise, meaning the man back in England who had promised them of anything. And it didn't fill them up or warm them when they realized that they were now all alone on this cold shore. But, well, it might have made them remember what the psalmist said, "It is better to trust in the Lord than to have confidence in man." It is better for one to put one's trust in the Lord than to trust in princes, much less in merchants, nor in the Son of Man, for there is no help in them. And I close this section by reading, "Blessed is he that has the Lord of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God." I hope I've drawn you into your life. I hope somehow you captured the message of this amazing book written between 1620 and 1647, which is saying that, you know, these people were up against it. And no doubt there are many times in your life when you feel as if you're up against it. And I have a list with me this morning of those things that we might feel that we're up against. We're up against the pressures of family life, aren't we? We're up against the pressures of not having the money that we really feel we need in order to handle what we'd like to do. We're up against the pressure of people around us, children probably more than anything, and maybe our own inner hearts that are saying, but I want so much more I want. I wish I had it. I really wish I had it. I wish I could do this, and I wish I could do that. I wish I wore finer clothes. I wish I had somebody better to support me. I wish I had somebody in my home, maybe somebody in my bed. I feel lonely. I feel wanting. Those are all common feelings. Nothing's changed in what, 365 years? The pressures of our environment, the loneliness of our Plymouth plantation is that we every day experience much less space for movement. And that works on us, you know. I'm awfully glad that I live where I live, that I don't live in the difficulty of movement that I see happening here in the Walnut Creek, Pleasant Hill, Concord area, Evermore. And the fact that a vote was just taken this week that said, let's cut down that excessive use of space is a statement that we're saying, we can't take that anymore. The stress is too much. Our stress isn't that there's nobody here, it's that there's too many here. You are constantly surrounded by the stress of nuclear threat. And it seems that as we come closer to a meeting of possibly great people, I don't know if they're great or not, but those whom we would deem great at a conference over in Geneva, it would seem as if we would hope that something might come out of that, but doesn't that make the nuclear threat really closer, more imminent, more conscious in our minds? And aren't we being told that our children feel it? Now, rather than having Indians, we have bombs. Certainly, we're increasingly aware of the deficit that weighs heavily upon us. It's hard to believe that we could have gotten ourselves as a country into a deficit position, but we have. The environment of our times includes tons of information. Haven't you noticed that? I'm sure you have. We're all overwhelmed by the bureaucratic display of red tape and roadblocks. Everything we own requires a second party in order to keep it going. Isn't that maddening? You can't buy a thing, but that you've got to be aware, and what if it breaks down? That adds a dimension to it of involvement. Frankly, when you walk on Plymouth Plantation, it would be easier if you just went out and had to deal with the elements and have to deal with the mechanics and waiting in line to get to the mechanic. There are more possibilities of demands on every person these days. Don't you know that? There are more options. You have more choices. You have more leisure time. That becomes a kind of pressure of the environment. I really mean having more options is absolutely sickening when you really think about it. Look at all you can do with your life. Don't you think it was much simpler when there was only one thing you could do? Survive. Now you have to worry, what will you do with your later years? What will you do with your retirement? We live so long now that becomes a whole new issue. The problem isn't whether you'll die too soon, it's whether you'll live too long. We're certainly experiencing the breakup of the family, loss of intimacy. I can still see my father's eyes the day that I said to him, I'm going to California and work in Walnut Creek, and his eyes just showed this pain that cut right through them, because my father, I think, was more the herder of the family than my mother was. And he said, you're going to California. And I could feel an ache in his being, and I'm sure it's still there in many of us who have displanted ourselves. We haven't come across an ocean, but we've left our family units. There's nobody to call upon. That becomes a stress. And isn't there a sense that we're being stretched, pulled out? Either we're being asked to do more, or we're having less and less to take care of ourselves with. That becomes a deep issue. Well, our issues are no different than the Pilgrims at Plymouth Plantation. They have different names, but the stresses are still the same. One day people may look back at you all and say, you were courageous. You were courageous to have survived the nuclear issues. You were courageous to have dealt with the environmental issues. You were courageous to have ridden on BART every day. You were insane to have driven a car on a freeway, because one day I don't think that mania will be going on. We will have replaced it, and they'll say, how did they survive? And maybe they'll look back through our church records and read our lessons and look at our tapes and say, that's how they did it. Well, I'd like to take a look at Mr. Bradford and see if we can draw from him the reminders that come down through the ages. And the first reminder is that they all made a compact together. And somehow, as I think about, and I have to include here the fact that we're about to build a building together or to own land together, that we're about to have a piece of the rock together, that there needs to be a compact made in every situation where you want to survive. And the issue here is, how do you survive over the long haul? You know, how do you keep a marriage over the long haul? How do you keep a church going over the long haul? I remember when I first arrived here in the area, it amazed me that after I'd been here 3 years, that out of the businesses that were down in the Oak Park Boulevard area, that out of the 10 that had been there had been turnovers in 7 out of the 10. And it made me feel real good about myself that at least I had lasted here 3 years when 7 businesses had collapsed in that period of time. And how do you allow that to happen? How do you allow to salvage something within your family unit? Well, I think you have to make a compact, and I think that's the reason they sat out there in that harbor that I got lost in this summer. We went out in my brother's boat and got lost in the fog out there, and I mean, it's hard to believe they could sit in that short little boat and with such short ceilings. The people were much shorter than they are today, you know. The tallest man on the Mayflower was 5'3", and it was Miles Standish. And when you realize these little people, well, what did they do? What did they realize they had to do? Well, they had to make a compact. They had to write an agreement together. They had to sit down with each other and say this, and think it through for yourselves. I have to make an agreement to live with those about me and find ways to survive together. That's what their compact said. I make an agreement to live with the others here on this boat and here on this land, and as a part of that commitment and agreement, I will find a way to survive together. I'm so mystified at how easily we all leave each other. I'm just blown away by that. I'm blown away by it in this center where I see people come in and fiddle about. And at the first indications that they may have to come up against themselves, I watch them dart like lemmings toward the sea, because there's been some myth sown here that's all going to be easy. I even had it expressed Wednesday evening in a class where somebody said, but it's got to be easier than that. You know, staying in with something and hanging in with something and staying married for so many years, and I'm not here to make a testimony to long-term marriage, but I would like to offer that if you want one, it's going to require that you make a contract, a compact together, to make a commitment to hang with each other and to not let your spoiled ways get in your way. And the spoiled way is, well, if it isn't easy, if it doesn't come naturally, hear it, if it doesn't come naturally, then I'm not hanging around. If it takes any effort out of my system, I'm not going to stay. Isn't it wonderful that they were stuck on the Atlantic coastline, and that they had the whole Atlantic coast they had to go back over if they wanted to say, oh, but this isn't like they said it was going to be. And what marriage is like they said it is going to be anyway? What relationship is like they said it was going to be? What career that you set out to get into when you graduated from college and they gave you the degree and you danced off the stage and said, here I come, boy, you're going to feel it from me, you're going to see it different because I'm around. And then the first day the door closed, you said, oh, well, this wasn't quite what I hoped it would be. I'm going somewhere else and take my eggs with me. How do you overcome that part of yourself? It's such a catch-22, and so many people are caught in it. You have to make a commitment. You have to make an agreement that I'll stay here. We'll live with each other and we'll survive. We have a vision and we're going to do this together. And notice that as a part of that Mayflower Compact. And isn't it interesting to use the word compact, not contract, but compact. As a part of that, they said we do this in the presence of God. You see, basic to these people was something that's really been lost. I think we've built a myth that it's better if you can get along with God than it's better if you can get along without God than if you can with God. For heaven's sakes, don't mention God. For heaven's sakes, don't mention you have a private life. Don't mention that you have a prayer life with God. Don't talk about it. I watch people who, when I say to them, well, what about your prayer life? What are you doing with it? And they get all kind of shy and back inside, like this isn't something you talk about. Our forefathers talked about it. They wrote it into everything in the presence of God. Is that in your home? Is that what you carry with you in your workplace? Are you proud? I mean, I know that those Christians who are out there proselyting everybody are a nuisance. I mean, I know that, and I know you don't want to be like that. Last Sunday morning I was down walking on the beach, and I was approached by somebody who was out to get me for God. You know, and I don't want any of that. I don't want any of that kind of what looks like cheap ostentation to me. I'm sorry, that's the way I look at the thing. And I said to him, look, I came here to be quiet and get away from people, not to be around them. Leave me alone. That was all I said to him. But we can go too far with that thing and thereby leave it out of everything. We become quiet professors of the faith. And we don't mention to our children, I believe in God. Did you know that? We don't say grace at the table. We don't bring the idea of God. We just keep standing back like we're pushed by the winds against some wall, and there's nothing we can do about it. These people said in the presence of God, I write the Mayflower Contract, the Mayflower Compact. And what do you make a compact with? Well, you make it with everything, you know. You make it with your body. I make a compact with my body. And if my body breaks down, I won't leave it. A lot of people do, you know. They start punishing their body when their body breaks down or when they see a few wrinkles. When relationships aren't what they want, well, I've already done that one. You make it with everything in your life. With everything in your life. Some people said to me last week after I told the story about the boat, they said, well, guess you'll sell the boat. Well, you know, I didn't buy a boat to sell a boat. I bought a boat to have a relationship with a boat and to grow with a boat. It's no difference than with a human being. I agreed to stay with it and to survive with it. The second thing, and there were only 4 of them, was that I watched these people tighten up their resources. They tightened up when the difficulties came. Now, we live in California, and California tends to be a loosening up society. Now, I don't know whether that's changing, but that's exactly what I've observed, is the desire to, you know, we use these words like, well, when it's ready, we'll do it. When I'm ready, I'll do it. Or when the feeling strikes me, I'll stop smoking. Or when I stop having this hunger and this tug for somebody, I'll drop the affair. The horrible stuff is that you don't get ready, the hunger and tug doesn't stop, and the desire to quit smoking or drinking or whatever your thing is, or being snide, doesn't leave you. You have to become involved. I'm convinced you have to become involved. Becoming involved is not a matter of ease. It is a matter of commitment. And I watched the Pilgrims do that. They tightened up when the going got tough. I recently sat down at the piano to show somebody the effects of playing with awareness on a piano keyboard, and I was amazed that when I play with awareness on a piano keyboard, what comes through is that there has to be a kind of tightness that is communicated into my body system, like a kind of resistance in order to derive quality. Did you hear that? There has to be a kind of resistance, a kind of struggle to derive quality. I really believe in that. I don't know if I'm talking spirit this morning or just good Yankee upbringing. I don't know what I'm talking this morning, but I know for quality, resistance is required. I know it, and you can't get out of it. I was in Houston a couple of weeks ago during a workshop, and I stayed with a family that I was absolutely charmed by, and one of the stories that they told me was that since they had come to Houston, they'd left their home and been moved there by an oil company, and when they got to Houston, they realized that the cost of living in New Orleans versus Houston was extremely different, and that they know that their budget now was, they were having to spend money out of their principal in order to make it every month. Do you know what that's like? I mean, I'm sure you know what that's like. And you know what they did? They tightened up their resources. They sat down with their children. They said, kids, you know we're spending over. Some things are going to have to be denied, and you're going to have to enter into this thing. You know, the kid who always wants another tape recorder and a car at 16 and a college education free and a this and a that. Well, they sat down with them and they said, this is what's required. And you know what those kids did? And I don't know how they got those kids to participate. And maybe you need to tell me some of your stories about your successes. The kids did participate. The kids stopped whining. The kids stopped begging. The kids stopped sharing how much they wanted and how much they didn't have what everybody else had, and they joined in. I can remember when I was 13 years old, they bought me a grand piano, my Steinway grand piano in my family, and my parents, in order to do that at that time, had to come up with $500, which was a lot of money at that time. And they sat us all down. They said, look, in order for Carol to have her piano, we've all got to have a little bit less. And don't you think that was hard for my brothers? Don't you think they wanted to say, what about me? Don't you think my father wanted to say, look, Carol, you've got your piano, and now I can't be a member of a golf club? All the principle here is that they tightened up their buckles. I would like you to know that the Houston story ends this way, that a year later that the company gave a bonus to the people who had had to shift companies. And when the bonus was given out, the parents shared the bonus with the children. I watch this desire for more, more, more everywhere. I see it right here at this center. People wanting more from the staff, wanting the center to do more, wanting the center to take care of more of this part of them, more of that part of them. I watch amongst my staff. You know, everybody's got to have a room with a window in it. I mean, it's ridiculous what's happened to our spoiled consciousness around here. Nobody can put up with anything. Am I the only one who was raised, put up with a little bit kid? And as I said, this may not be a spiritual message, this may be just a New England message. But put up with a little bit. You can't have it all at some points in your life. And maybe not being able to have it all is a spiritual message. We have to learn to value each other's limits. We have to be able to say to our children, not now, and maybe not next month. And then we have to be able to honor that. Maybe they'll give us back one of those positive thinking messages that says, well, where's your consciousness if you can't produce one more thing? How come you can't create in your reality a new house next month? Have you had them throw it at you yet? Have any of your kids thrown it at you, or any of your friends? Do you know what I'm talking about with that one? Nod your heads just a little bit. So we beat each other over the heads with our spiritual value judgments. So you can't create a new car, huh? So you can't create a new body. What's that do to us? When the value is, it's time to stop. It's time to tighten up. The third one is giving thanks, practicing gratitude. We must. I'm not going to say much about that, but we must give thanks. The Pilgrims did it. We too must. And I mean thanks constantly. We've developed a bad habit, and our thanks only comes when the good comes in. What about thanks always? What about a joyful heart when things don't look like you want them to? And I'll tell you what gratitude does. It just elevates the spirit. It gives you the bounty to go back again and again and again. And the last one is, don't you notice that all these poor pilgrims talked about was prayer? I'm not sure what prayer accomplishes, incidentally. I'm not sure at all. But I'll tell you what, if I were to stand up here with an insurance policy and offer this to you, which is what I think prayer offers, I wonder if you'd buy it. I'd like to sell you an insurance policy this morning that will give you the following guarantees. If you participate, it will definitely draw the people whom you are around closer together. As a part of this insurance policy, I guarantee you that by your participating in it, it will open up channels into higher realms of clarity and creativity. If you take this insurance policy this morning and participate in it, I promise you that it will provide you with a sustenance that you can depend upon, so that when you get scattered and scared and you don't know where to go, you'll have a little memory button inside that says, oops, I can go and pray about this and I'll check in with something. And another part of this insurance policy is that it will offer to you the option of being able to increase your supply. It will offer to you the option of healing your physical body. It will offer to you the option of being able to create a deeper life force within your system. That insurance policy is called prayer. It's not made for weaklings, contrary to public opinion, who usually sells this insurance policy to the weaklings. Prayer is made for those who are willing to participate, and the only price you pay for this insurance policy is that you participate daily, and if possible, every second. And if you can, and if you will, then you have those guarantees, and I'd like to read them to you again, because they are what allowed our forefathers to survive. They will draw people closer. It will. It will open up channels into higher realms of clarity and creativity. It will provide you a sustenance that you can depend upon, and it will offer the option of increasing supply and healing. I don't think there's any close to this lesson. I think it's a lesson of a beginning. It's a lesson that says if we want to make it over the long haul, we must make a compact to survive together and to stay with each other and to stay with whatever we've committed to, whether it's easy or hard. The other thing that's required is that we have to tighten up our belts sometimes. Sometimes you can't have it all. Sometimes you have to close it in. It requires thanksgiving, and it calls for prayer. I invite you to participate. Rudy's going to sing now a solo for you, and he's going to be accompanied by a cellist. Won't you use this time to be inward and to consider maybe what you've received this morning?